Okay, welcome back. So, where does the community organizing tradition come from? As I say, an ancient tradition, the idea of collective action for a nonviolent change in society, but it takes a specific shape in the 1930s. And one of its key early figures was a young graduate student, the son of immigrants, named Saul Alinsky. And he had studied in universities in Chicago that taught what we call a progressive philosophy. People like John Dewey, Jane Addams, who were thinking not of about poverty as an individual problem, about individual morality, which was a lot of the kind of conventional wisdom of the 19th century, but thinking more about these type of problems as systemic problems. How do you understand how all of the parts of a community fit together and to produce things like domestic violence or mass unemployment or discrimination, and how in fixing how people interact in the community, people can themselves reorganize the community to make change possible, and that this could only be done through experience, not from kind of magic formula ideology from outside, but only by people from the inside of the community stepping up and learning and thinking systemically, not house by house by house, but how the whole system fits together, what kind of resources are needed, etc. And so this beginning of the systemic understanding of social change and social problems led to a new way of thinking about how to get inside a community and help facilitate a kind of a transformation. And this community called Back of the Yards was one of the poorest communities in Chicago, highly populated by immigrants doing manual labor for the most part, with high levels of unemployment and unsanitary conditions and alcoholism and related social problems. So, what Saul Alinsky proposed after this, as part of this first experience in Chicago, was a kind of a method, which is not, again, an ideology as much as a toolkit. So, to become an organizer, Alinsky trained people who he worked with to first, you have to do your homework. You have to gather data about what's happening in the neighborhood to see how these systemic problems are manifesting in order to be able to find intervention points. It might be a public health campaign. It might be a drive to change the city budget to allow more people from that community access to city jobs. So you have to do your homework. Second is that you cannot come from the outside and propose a master plan. That you can only begin an organizing campaign if you're invited by people from that community who themselves are the hosts and the leaders of the campaign. That the members of the campaign are not just participants, but he referred to them as leaders. That the local people are the ones who are the most credible and legitimate, and therefore the ones who should be the most visible, not the organizer, him or herself. That you should work within the existing structures that in the community, whether it's the religious associations or sports associations or other community associations, understand how power works and how influence works in the neighborhood, and don't try to reinvent the wheel. And then finally, you don't try to create campaigns that last forever. You want to help facilitate a campaign that generates momentum, that generates real concrete progress on health or jobs, and then step aside. That's what an organizer should do, not become a permanent part of the specific neighborhood. He was also inspired by the organized labor community, especially one of its early leaders, John L. Lewis, who saw beyond the factories and the workplaces to the communities that lay around these industrial sites as places where poor people needed to talk and work together and build common strategies to put pressure on a system that was often being very violent and or neglectful of them. And so Alinsky organizes these neighborhood councils in the back of the yards, drawing on church and temperance, that is to say, anti-alcohol networks, to challenge politicians and have these people work together to challenge politicians with very specific requests. And the result of this first big organizing campaign were new relief jobs that were, state funded to bring people from this neighborhood who didn't have any real political connections into that network of city jobs. Help the meat packers in the neighborhood win a new contract. Help create more funding for school meals, new healthcare services. So these were concrete victories, not utopian dreams. These were looking at concrete issues and trying to make one win lead to more energy and to get to the next win. So something that Alinsky writes in his book Rules for Radicals, which has often been caricaturized by the conservative media in the U.S. as a radical, socialist or communist. It's actually one of the most pragmatic works of political thought published in the last century, and you see Alinsky's pragmatism. He was not an ideologue who wanted to create, a utopian proletariat state. He talked about words like that people often on the left were very afraid of, words like power. He said, if you don't understand how power works in the current system, you can't generate it. So you have to understand how the networks of power work in order to be able to put pressure in the right place. Self-interest, also not a bad word. You can't mobilize people if you don't understand what matters to them and what is driving them. And so you have to listen. You have to listen hard and understand where people are coming from and their values and their motivations. Compromise, also not a bad word. You need to build coalitions, and to build a coalition, you have to understand that you can't be ideologically pure all the time. You have to give a little bit to get a little bit. To get, we say in American English, half a loaf of bread is better than none at all. And so, of course, you have to have red lines. You have to know what are the values you won't compromise on, but you also have to be open to making coalitions with people who you don't agree with on every issue in order to get to a majority, which is what you need to make sustainable change. Ego, also not a bad thing if you are using your sense of self-belief and self-worth as a source of positive motivation, constructive motivation. Leaders of the campaign, not just the organizers, but the leaders, should believe in themselves and take ownership over their own story. And finally, conflict, also not a bad thing. We shouldn't just be trying to get in a circle and sing Kumbaya. We have to put pressure, not violently, but in a very concerted and sometimes surprising way, to get existing structures, including oppressive, discriminatory, dysfunctional political or economic structures, need pressure if they're going to change. So these are some of the key ideas, and I highly recommend Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, as a great pragmatic guide for becoming a good organizer. And you see here just a short summary of what an organizer would try to do, right? First, you see that the organizer has to begin with we say in French, a travail sur soi. You have to work on yourself first, understand your own motivations to be able to connect constructively with other people. You have to do your homework, identify the issue, whether it's health or the pollution or domestic violence or sexism or unemployment. Figure out what is the issue that this community most needs to take action on. And then it's about relationship building through door-to-door campaigns, one-on-ones, where you just meet with one person and get to know them by sharing your story and hearing their story. Working through associations, actors, including people who are part of the political system. Relationship building, forming a team around an issue that the team cares about, and being able to facilitate this kind of reflection, to build a strategy, to set goals, to be able to manage conflict within the group, and then take action. And as you act iteratively. So you never, you don't wait to find the perfect strategy, the perfect time. You find what is the short-term action we can take, and then debrief. And this is something that advocates often forget, is the importance of, after an action, sitting and thinking with your team, what worked, what didn't work, what can we learn for next time, and going back and reshaping your strategy and adjusting it. So this is kind of the shape of an organizing campaign. And of course, once you get that win, you make sure to celebrate. Even if you don't win, you always celebrate the efforts of the team, and you keep building a better and better strategy. So these experiences in Chicago grew and became more widespread around people organizing for the rights of workers, the rights of women, the rights of African Americans, the rights of migrant laborers. In 1940, the Industrial Areas Foundation, the first network of community organizers, was founded. And one of the key principles was Saul Alinsky's notion that the victims of poverty, people who have been traditionally victimized and excluded from leadership, should become the leaders of the movement. So these set of tools and principles that were formulated in the 30s and 40s in Chicago then are transformed in a new generation in the 1950s and 60s, especially in the struggle for civil rights for African Americans as well as for migrant farm workers. And you see here Cesar Chavez, one of the great civil rights leaders, and his young protege, a young man by the name of Marshall Gans. So the United Farm Workers Campaign, this was a very difficult time to be a farm worker in California. California, which had contributed a huge number of young people to the war effort in the 1940s, and that as a result, many young workers from Mexico were called up into California, given jobs, and stayed because the agricultural sector was expanding and needed them. But of course, these workers who had been invited to come and work in the fields, avocados and almonds and fruits and all these other important products, had no political power because they weren't citizens, which meant that they could be exploited. They could be squeezed as much as their labor at minimum cost to the companies and the farms without any consequence to those farms and companies. And so the challenge was how to build power in a situation where these people were not only poor, but poor without any kind of legal or civic protections. And so Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez were two of the community leaders that organized the United Farm Workers, the first union to represent migrant farm workers in the 1960s, and led a direct action of nonviolent boycott of grapes in farms that had not agreed to engage in bargaining with their own workers. They used some of the same tactics that Alinsky had developed in Chicago, as well as inventing new forms of advocacy, including a march from the fields to the state capital of Sacramento in 1966, an example of the creativity of community organizers, how you have to be constantly inventing new tactics to gain visibility and attention and sympathy and build pressure on systems that have oppressed and neglected you. And the results of this organizing, again, with very few resources, Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, Marshall Gans, and the full movement of migrant farm workers won the first collective bargaining agreement for farm workers in U.S. history, contracts that included rights to clean water, access to toilets, to rest periods, protection against pesticides, first contracts banning discrimination, sexual harassment of workers, which had been a huge problem, and of course, basic rights of health care, first union health care and pension plans, which was a form of mutual aid. So these were concrete wins and improvements to the life and working lives and success of this community. And then in the 1980s, on the south side of Chicago, comes a young graduate of Columbia, Barack Obama. And if you read his book, Dreams from My Father, 4 chapters of the book, this is his book he published as a young man at Harvard Law School, 4 chapters are dedicated to his time in Chicago as a community organizer, helping folks in the poor areas of south side of Chicago to organize for to get asbestos and other poisonous materials out of their buildings, to organize for to get cities to put unemployment offices and more resources from the city in their neighborhoods. And I invite you to read Dreams from My Father. It's a great first person account of the life of an organizer. And then when this man later became elected to the Senate from Illinois and runs for president, some of the young people who had been trained by Marshall Gans in a previous campaign, the campaign of Howard Dean, become actively involved in Senator Obama's campaign, and Marshall Gans then his organizing methods become the heart of the grassroots campaign to elect Barack Obama President of the United States. So in the next video, we're going to look at the early history of storytelling and why stories are such an important part of our human experience.